Welcome to the webinar on creating a custom title block for SOLIDWORKS Electrical. We're going to be learning a lot of different aspects here, so I'm going to be throwing a lot at you, but the big things to keep in mind is we're going to be trying to create something that's eye-catching. We're going to do it from scratch. I'll show you a little bit about some of these simple formulas that we're talking about for page numbering using the actual page number and the row number for each of those rows to show it easily on the page. I'll give you some examples of some best practices for that grid, ortho, and snap. So let's get right into it. First of all, we need to start by asking a question. Will this title block be for an ANSI template or an IEC template? And I'm referring to whether it's going to be in inches, whether it's going to be in metric. So without opening up a project, we're going to open up the software. We're going to go directly to our library, and we're going to go into the title block management. Here we're going to go ahead and select new. We're not going to really care what these filters are because we can change them when we are creating this new title block. We're also not going to worry about the rows and the columns just yet, but first let's go ahead and put in a title. And I always like to make sure that I am adding it also to the description, because you will find that in your case of your library, you're going to see only the description and not necessarily the title. So be cautious of that. Now for our example, I am going to use ANSI because I work normally in the North American standard. So I use inches. I use 11 by 17 inch pages. And so that's truly what I'm going to work with, is a B size sheet. Now, the second thing to keep in mind is only when there is no graphics in this area can you change this drawing unit system. If you change it afterwards, it will affect how your symbols, your title blocks work. So only change this before there is any type of graphics. You could also add this to the library. At this point, we don't really have a library that I'm going to be adding. So I'm just going to simply say OK. Now we need to find the title block. Title block here for me is under the ANSI size. So I'm going to go ahead and just double click here on this webinar title block. And you'll see that you have absolutely no graphics going on, but you do have a couple of things going on currently. One, you'll see down in the lower left-hand corner that I have the origin. You will notice that the origin is also being placed down at the very lower right-hand corner here, that if I select this position, you'll see that X and Y is almost 0, 0. Truly, if I were to snap directly on that point, it is 0, 0. The insertion point is also at 0, 0. And for title blocks, this is always where the insertion point should be. Now, let's talk about the properties pane over here on the right hand side. So if you don't have this properties pane open, please go ahead and open it. This is where you will be able to make changes as long as your title block is highlighted on the left. You have information over here on the properties pane on the right task pane. We're going to start by opening up the drawing parameters, which are down in the very lower right-hand corner of your screen. I'm going to simply right-click here to open up the window. Now, the first thing, let's talk about the fact of some best practices here. When you are saving this title block, we want to make sure that we have snap on and ortho and grid. Why? Because we always want to draw lines that are straight vertically or straight horizontally, because the symbols will then snap directly to those wires. The second one is, of course, the snap. Now, right now, I am set up for a 1/2 inch spacing on my snap. I like to use things more closely aligned with my symbols. My symbols are using a 0.25 snapping, so I also set my grid to that as well as my sapping point, just because this makes things so much easier. Lastly, I'm going to make sure that O snap is not on, because we don't want to have the O snap working inside of your project when you are drawing, because you are now no longer using the snap point if it's got some settings turned on for O snap or object snap. Lastly, we said that we were going to make this 11 by 17 sheet. So the grid zone right now says that the lower left-hand corner is 0, 0, but the upper right-hand corner is 11 by 9, or 12 by 9. We are going to make this 17 inches in the X direction and 11 inches in the Y direction. You can open this up and close it at any point in time, but those are the information that we are truly going to be using for this title block. Now, let's go ahead and talk just a little bit about that grid for a moment. This grid is truly what is going to be essential. It's not essential for the user for guidance, but it is critical in the printing process. Because your printing of the software is going to recognize the grid and this outer boundary of the grid for determining what size to print. So making sure that you have the proper size grid is important, especially when you're scaling things up or scaling things down. All right, so we've talked about the O snap, we've talked about the snap setting. We've turned those on. We are going to go ahead and save our work right now, because while we are working in a title block, notice that I have a DWG. I am going to go up here and simply say save, just to save my work, because the SQL does not manage that at this point in time. Now that I've got it saved, we're going to use the draw and modify commands to continue. Now the first thing I like to do is draw a rectangle. Now what I'm doing with the rectangle, I am leaving my cursor, and I'm not even moving my cursor, but over on the left hand side, a command has started for the rectangle. I am going to tell it that I want it to start at 0, 0 for the start of my rectangle, and simply hit enter. I am not moving my cursor at all, and what I am going to do is I am going to tell it that I want an 11 by 17 rectangle. Well, of course, I don't want 11 in the X direction. I want 17 in the X direction, so I'm going to type in 17, 11. And when I hit enter, I now get a rectangle that is 11 by 17. Notice that my grid has readjusted. Once you zoom out, that grid will readjust to the size that you have specifically specified. So once we have that, what I am using this for is to be able to use it as a reference point. If I am importing a DWG that is just my title block and I want to bring that in, because of course we do have that option, you can simply come over here to File and go to Open, and you can open up a DWG file of your own and bring in the graphics. So let's talk a little bit further about this drawing boundary. Inside here, I am possibly wanting to draw a second title block. This outside one is more for just the reference for printing. So maybe I'm going to draw a rectangle, and I don't have to use this measurement tool. I can come over here and maybe I'm going to select that it is going to be this upper grid point, and I'm going to draw a rectangle, And this rectangle, I am going to stop it maybe a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch short. Here I'm going to drop it an inch short. And I can tell that by the grid settings here. I'm going to drop it an inch short. This is going to actually be my title block, so that way I have that area specifically for hole punching. What that's going to allow me to do is when I print this out, I'm not going to have to worry about those custom margins because I will be able to add those holes in here to possibly put these title blocks into a print. Now, if you're not going to be printing them out, you probably don't need this. But for anybody that is using an actual plotter or printer and wanting to put it in some form of a book, you might want that extra area. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is now highlight that rectangle. I'm going to change the color. So I'm going to come over here, instead of making that bi-layer color, I'm going to hit the ellipsis or the 3 dots, and I am going to just type in a color, and my color is going to be 100. Now you can see that that's a bright green. So I have that, but now it's still not thick enough. So I'm going to want to change the thickness of that line. We're going to change the global width of that line, and I am going to change it to 0.0156. Now what that's going to do is make it a nice thicker line. So you can tell when you zoom in now that when I zoom in, it's thicker than this outside boundary. So the next thing to consider is, where are we going to be placing all of our information? Is it going to be down along the bottom of the title block, or is it going to be on the side? It can be on the right side, on the left side. I'm going to place mine over on the right side just because that's a different style of title block than what most people are used to seeing. Now, I'm going to add the company logo. So that company logo, when you go and say insert image instead of attach image, insert image is going to insert the image directly in this drawing. When you say attach image, you are literally taking it from where it is located and just putting a reference there. So inserting the image is going to be your best practice. When I go ahead and say insert image, I can then find the image that I'm looking for. Now, when you are using an older version of older than 2023, you will only have the option to use a BMP file. Therefore, go ahead and use Paint to open up your logo to save it as a BMP file. If you're using 23 or later, you have lots of options as far as the different formats that are available, including BMP, JPEG, PNG. And so let's go ahead and say insert image. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind, notice that I have a couple of different logos here. Ones are on the side, ones that are horizontal. And the reason being is that you will not be able to rotate the logo once you place it on the page. So it is always better to have that logo already orientated in the direction that you are looking for. I'm going to start by selecting just a logo and place it. Now, the commands, notice that I have specified later the insertion point and the scale. So that way, when I do this and I say, okay, I'm going to simply place my left cursor, I'm going to left click, and as I bring my cursor to the right, you can see that the size aspect ratio is being kept. When I left click again, it is going to place that now. So I might have to select a different logo. And so I'm going to select a different logo here. And I'm going to try a different one. So you'll be able to play with this and figure out what works best for you. I'm going to go ahead and change just my background because my background is at this point in time. I have to go ahead and save my title block. And then I'm going to go ahead and close this title block, and now I can come over here to Tools and to my interface configuration, and I'm just going to make this white for right now and apply that. Now I can get right back into my library of my title block, go back into my webinar type. All right, so there we go. Now I can place this up here. Now if you were to try and rotate that, so let's go ahead and say insert image, and I were to try and rotate that. So I'm just going to place this here, and I'm going to say rotation is specified later. Notice that I cannot change the rotation. It is not allowing that. So the only way you're going to get something vertical is if you were to actually have a vertical title, a vertical logo that you then are placing. And that, of course, is going to keep that same aspect ratio. All right, so those are some things to keep in mind. Now, one thing to notice is that when you are clicking on any of your logos, by grabbing a grip point here, you can resize these types of, so notice as I'm growing bigger and larger, you can also make it smaller. The center grip point is actually for relocation. The next thing I want to point out is that you can open up existing title blocks. Now, why would I open up an existing title block? When I am working here now, I want to add some of the attributes that might be being used in an existing title block. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and open up an existing project, and I'm simply going to create a new one so that way I can see what I'm truly working with. I'm going to add all this information. Maybe this is contract here, and then I might add the fact that this is Acme, and I might say address 1, and I might populate the entire thing here. So that way I can see what these different attributes are. Design a house, address 1. And let's see, if I scroll down, I can even see some of this user data. So I might put in something like this. Just put in some X's. All right. When I go to open up my project, it's using a default title block at this moment. I'm going to use that default title block, and I'll be able to easily see. So let's just go ahead right now. I am going to open up that project. So let's go ahead to, it is open in my sheets. Here's my project. I'm going to go ahead and open up my schematic sheet just so I can see what's actually happening. So I can see that I have a GoEngineer ANSI. That is actually the project template name. And if I look, I'm going to add this pencil over here on the right hand side. This is going to allow me to make changes to this drawing. If I notice that the name of the sheet is Power and 04, here is that power name. And if I come down further, I have some additional information going on. Notice here's the contract number. It's been designed by me with a scale, a date, and a drawing number. All of this information I can actually get from the existing title block. So, and you will also see that I have a rev table going on. This rev table is a rolling rev table. So right now I have revision 0. When I go to revision 1, Revision 1 will be in this line. Revision 0 will be in the upper line. The next time that I add a revision, 0 will drop off. 1 will be available, and then 2 will be available. So this is a rolling revision table. I'm going to use this existing title block then to give me my attributes that I am going to be working with. To open that up, I can simply come over to my right side here, and I can see this title block. If I go to the ellipsis, I will then go directly to the library. Now this library doesn't tell me which title block. It does give me this name, but maybe I want to find it a little bit easier. So here's what I'm going to do. Instead, I'm going to use the drop-down arrow over here on the right, and I am going to say open. When I say open, now I can see these attributes that are down here in the lower right-hand corner. Come on. This comes from just a regular title block. All I did was take this information and add it. How did I get that? Well, I went from library to the title block manager, and I took just any of the title blocks that came out of your software when it was installed. So if I look, you have an ANSI with rows, you have an ANSI with the scale, and so I took this title block. Now notice I actually have a number of title blocks open right now. I took this information, so notice here I took this folio TZ0L1 and I brought it directly into my project, and I believe that one is up here at the top. There it is right here. So that is the project name. Now, how do I know that? Well, for one, I can come to this edit title block area, and you'll see the pound sign or the hashtag, and there's a little drop down arrow. You can say show attributes, show a sample value, or show what the attribute description is. So if I say show the attribute description, this is telling me from over here on the right, I can see it's project. It is the project description. If I highlight this one, notice that it says folio description. What that is referring to is folio is the drawing. If I am looking for other attributes that are not necessarily listed on the title blocks that I am working with, I can come up to this edit title block and I can say insert attribute and provide any of the attributes in this section that are available. So in drawing, you can see folio tag. Here again is where I'm coming up with that numerator and denominator for the scale. I have the number of the drawing. I like to use folio tag, which is the mark, because that way I can control what is being shown. Is it having a leading 0? Is it not? And I can define this in the project template, which is why I like using the file mark rather than the order number. The order number is referring to what order you had created the documents. No matter what the number is, the order is which one is created first. Now, notice here there's also revisions, and revisions for each of those rolling lines. So anything that is red here, or blue here, sorry, is being used currently in the title block that I am looking at. So if I am looking at my new title block that I have created, I have not added any attributes yet. I can come to any title block and simply highlight what it is that I am wanting to copy. If I want to copy all of this, use a right to left selection. You can copy everything. Now, if you want it copied to a specific point, you can right-click on a dashed line, and you can say copy with an insertion point. It then is looking for, in the command on the left, the insertion point, which I am going to say is 0, 0. So that way I have a nice origin position. I can come to my webinar title block, and I'm going to get rid of my 2 logos because I have them from the other title block. You may not, but you can build this type of stuff from draft site and simply do a copy paste, and using that insertion point, you can make it very controllable. So now I can right click and say paste, and I can come directly to that origin position and I can drop it. And you can now see the differences as far as the spacing on where you may want things. And so you may need to make adjustments to your drawing depending on what you are looking for. The big thing that I want to point out, though, is you can also, when you are dropping in an attribute into your title block, you may have one, and I'm going to come down here to this lower section because this is exactly the area that I am looking for. Okay, so now if you notice here, this attribute has these brackets. How did I make that? Well, what I did, and I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of these so that way you can see how this works. Just replace that with the TZ0. Okay, so now we have this here. In order to make 4 lines of text, I can use the line feed. Now the line feed is simply the symbol, and I'm going to show you by just typing it in over here on the left. So I'm going to add some text, and you'll notice the symbol above your enter key on the right. You can hold the shift key and it's above the backward slash, is a pipe symbol, which is what I have drawn here. When I go ahead and say OK, and I'm just going to add this text here, you can now see that piece of text. This is a line feed or a return. So this attribute, when I am putting it in my project, if I want to use a line feed or a return so that my text doesn't get too long going across my title block, I can use one of these pipe symbols. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. So to do that, what we need to do is use a multiple attribute. So I'm going to come up here to my Edit Title Block tab, and I am going to say multiple attribute here, and I can select this attribute. Now over here on the left hand side, you will see that you have the number of attributes that you are wanting, and so I'm going to put up here that there is 4. And what I am going to do is, notice it says distance between the attributes. I like to position it on my screen. I don't like to use this dimension, so that way I can control just what this looks like. Now I can zoom in to this title block and I can highlight it. Notice it automatically put in that bracket, and my next one on my cursor is now available. I'm going to turn off my snap for a moment, and I am just going to place that attribute right below, and notice when I left click, I can then place the 3rd line, And then when I left click, I now have that fourth line. Now that I have those, I'm going to go ahead and cancel the command because I don't need that anymore. If I click on one of these, you'll see this grid point in the center of the text. Here's my next thing that I like to do just to cheat just a little bit. I might go ahead and draw a line, and I'm just going to draw a vertical line straight through. And let's see here, I can see that my snap is not quite where I want it, so I'm going to turn on my grid, and I can see, of course, that we were using that 1/4 inch. For the moment, I'm going to change it to 0.0625. What that's going to do is give me a little bit more control, so now I can snap a little bit closer to maybe centered between these two areas. And I am going to draw a line. So let's just snap right here and draw a line. This line isn't going to stay here, but what I can do now is I can use my O snap. So I'm going to right click and I am going to say nearest. And I'm going to turn on object snap but turn off my snap. So I'm only using object snap. Now this is one of those times that using object snap is great because now I can do some alignment. So there are other ways that you can align, but here now I can select that center point and notice that when I left click on it, it turns red, and then I can move it to be on this line so that everything is nice and clean. And now we have all of those aligned. And now I can go ahead and get rid of that line. Okay, so from here, what I can do is you can also do things like when I copy a specific attribute in, you can do something like copy properties, and those copy properties you can then right click and say apply copy properties. So all the information from the right as far as how it's justified, the height, the color, you can then control very quickly. So if you have lots of attributes that you are wanting to always be the same, you would be able to use this copy and apply. Now, the big thing that I want to point out here is this color being black and white. Don't use black, don't use white. Use this color scheme of black and white in your standard colors. Reason being is just like you saw when I started, that I had a black background. You're going to have those users that are using a black background while others are using the green background or using a gray background or a white background, and you don't want the text to disappear. So by you having a black and white color, you will make things easier on yourself. Now you'll also notice that there is a layer 0 that we are working with. And this works similar to your AutoCAD, where with your AutoCAD you have layers. Well, under Modify, you have layers. Now these layers, notice here we have a title block layer. This title block layer is going to be that title block when you place it in your project. It is going to then be available and not be selectable. So that's the one nice thing about this. But what you can also do is add additional layers that could be watermarks. So that there is a blog on our website for how to create watermarks. So look into that if you're into wanting to stamp your prints for release or final build or preliminary, that you can easily use layers and make them printable and non-printable when you are wanting to release those drawings. So just something else to keep in mind. All right, so we've got this title block, and yes, I might want to do some more cleanup to it, but this is still working very nicely here. I can save this. And now if I want to go ahead and try this out, I have created that project. I'm going to go ahead and close up these other title blocks because I don't need those. And I have my project that I started with here that I created from scratch. Now, you can test out your title block. Simply come over to your sheet that you have open and use that drop down, and you can say replace. And let's replace this with our new title block that we are currently using. So again, you can always use the filters to find that title block. Here I know that it is called webinar. And no matter where it's at, I can simply say any class and I will find that title block and say select. Now it doesn't change until you hit the green check. So you can see now I have this title block started. Well, I may need some row numbers. This is still looking good. I can see the power. I can see ANSI. If I were to come up to my project name, by highlighting the project, I can change that ANSI. So let's go ANSI. Let's go ahead and say webinar title block. And change that. Add that green check, and you will notice that that has changed it here. So, and the same type of thing is happening down at the bottom. Here I can change this from power. I can highlight the name of the sheet. Simply come over here to the description. Change this to maybe this is spare. And hit the green check. After I've clicked off the field, I can hit the green check, and now I can say spare, which changes it here and changes it on my title block. So that is looking good. All right, well, what about rows? Well, rows and columns. Now you may want to create a title block with rows and columns, or it might just have rows. Now, the first thing we talked about was the fact that with a title block, we might want to use the row tag. Now, why do I say that? In a template, you are going to have that option of figuring out how you want to mark your rows. So if I go to the drop-down arrow for configurations, I can go to marks. And I can see up in this top section here that there is a row, a column, and a drawing number. Now the drawing number that I am using, notice that mine have leading zeros. Well, that is controlled by this specific formula of STRZ val file order number, with wanting 2 digits before the decimal and 0 after. That is what this is doing. So in my project then, what I am going to do is this is now the tag for that specific drawing. That row then becomes this formula of file tag. I'm going to hit the formula button here so that way you can see it a little bit better. In the variables and simple formulas, file tag is the file mark. Remember, file is drawing. So it is the drawing mark. So that is that 01, 02, 03, 04, 05. So if I want to have row numbers that are picking up the sheet number, I can simply say file tag in my formula, plus I can then add the row number, and the row number, because I don't want it to have just 1, 2, 3, I might want that leading 0 or leading 2 zeros, that I am then using this formula to then create that row number. So I am adding a string that is that row order number that is being calculated into an integer, and it is then adding 2 digits to begin with before the decimal and 0 afterwards. So I get a row mark with 2 digits, and then I get, or a sheet with 2 digits, and then a row mark with 2 digits. What does that look like? Well, that I am putting in that row. And when I say apply and OK, and I will show you how to do this, we're going to look at the next sheet here because that title block, I already have it set up. So it is sheet 5. This is row 1. How did we do that? Well, let's go ahead and go into our title block. And here's how this works. Over here on the right hand side, you will see that you have the control of rows and columns. If you are wanting rows on your title block, you would hit the check mark to add it, but then we have to tell it the number of the first row. Now, unfortunately, you cannot tell it row 0. You must tell it row 1. I'm going to tell it row 1. The first position, well, the first position, if I look, is going to be so far away from your 0 position. So it is going to be up here. Now, if you want to verify this with some of the other title blocks, that is a way to do it. Now, do not change those originals, but you can open up a title block to see what you can reference there as far as those numbers. So I'm just going to open up that B with ANSI 2 column so that way I can see what that looks like. And you will see that here, you'll see that they added folio tag and then row. And what they are doing is they are putting the sheet number here and then a row number below it. We are combining the two with our mark. But notice here that the settings have changed because I am looking at this title block. It is using rows. The number of the first row is 1. It's saying that that first position is at 10.5 inches with the height of the row of -0.625, and 14 is the number of rows, and we are restarting at each column. All right, well, that means that we are looking at that this is 1 through 15, and then that this is 1 through 15 for this next set. In the one that I am using, you will notice that I have 1 through 22, and that my next one starts at 23 and continues on. So each type of title block might have some changes or differences that you can play around with. For us, what we want to look at is, yes, if you are going to be having more than one column, you are going to be selecting the column second. If you are not, what I normally do is I make these so that this column, before I turn off this check mark, I am going to say I have one column. The first column position, I am going to say starts at 0. The column width is the entire page. So therefore it is a 17-inch column from here to here. And the number of columns I have is 1. Once I have that, I am going to go ahead and turn off this check mark, and I am going to save. This is going to ensure that I am only using one column for this entire area and that it doesn't go off of the page. Now, we said that we were having rows. The number of the first row is 1. Well, first of all, we have to figure out how many rows are we having. Now, how do I figure that out? Well, I need to measure, and I'm trying to keep with that 1/4 inch spacing between the symbols because that's how those 3-phase symbols are set up, is for that 1/4 inch spacing. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save my title block before I continue. So that way, these settings are retained. Now I'm going to go to my modify command, and I can use a distance. So let's measure from the 0, 0 to maybe up here at that upper edge. Now, let's turn off that O snap and turn on snap, because I want to make sure I'm snapping to the grid. So from here to that top one, we said was 10.75. Okay, so close the distance command. This is going to be 10.75. Now, I'm going to save that, just because I like to save a lot when I am not working with SQL. When I'm working in that DWG CAD format, I'm wanting to always save. Now we need to figure out the negative distance, because we are moving closer and closer to 0. So from here, I am now wanting to drop down, and maybe I want to have each row be about 3/4 of an inch. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I am going to say negative 0.75, and that is going to be my distance. Now, I don't know how many rows I'm going to have, so I'm just going to go ahead and say maybe it's 15. And I can still say restart at each column, because I've only got one column here. And I'm going to click off of this field, and I'm going to save it again. Now, how do I make this work? Well, what I'm going to do here now is add an attribute. And that attribute, I'm going to use these settings. So here what I am going to do is I am going to say insert attribute, and I am going to find the position, which happens to be under miscellaneous. And under row, you can see that we have row here. And now how do I know where I'm placing this? Well, I know that first of all, the one thing I want to do is I'm going to be using that grid point of 0.625. Let's see here. We said we'll use 0.125 because we want to make sure that we are grabbing those grid points at that 1/4 inch. All right, so I'm going to change my background to black again, so that way you can see this a little bit easier. When you are switching while you are working in Titleblocks, I'm going to go ahead and save this real quick. If you change your background, you are going to see that things disappear or look a little bit crazy. Oops, that's not what I want. Let's change this back to black so that way I can see it a little bit better. And when I say apply, you'll notice that some things may disappear. So let's go ahead right now while it's changing all of that. And you'll notice, okay, so things disappeared. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close these sheets. Nope, don't need to save that one. And I'm going to close that one. And it's just a matter of reopening it. So now we'll say yes, just so that way I can make sure. And I'm going to open up that sheet again, just so that way I've got that reference. But we're working on our title block. So let's go back into library and let's find that webinar. So again, filters, and I can simply type in webinar and find that title block. Double click on it, even if it doesn't have a thumbnail, and notice that everything came back now. All right, so now I can see those grid points a whole lot easier. Here, what I am going to do is I'm going to make this left justified, or actually right justified, because I want it to be on the end. And let's see here. Well, actually it might be left justified, middle left. So now you'll see that you have a second point here. Now what I can do is make sure that that is on that grid point. Okay, so now let's go ahead and open up that other title block. Open up that other title block and notice here, so we're just talking about using that same attribute, just pound row. All right, so how did I get that nice and evenly spaced? Well, what I did was this. Let's go back to ours. We have its first position. We're going to highlight this, and we're simply going to go to our modify command, and we are going to use this array. Now, the array, how many rows do I want? Well, I know that I want at least 15, so let's say 20 at this point. How many columns do I want? Well, if you're doing columns, you can actually select the column now, and you can say how far this column is from this first position to the second. I can select the specific instance or instances of what are the items that I want. So select the object. You'll notice an empty square that you can highlight now. When you left click, you can say enter, and it brings the command back up. Now, the row offset. Well, I am using this negative 0.75. So let's add negative 0.75 to our offset here so that it goes down towards our 0 point. And with a column offset, it is going away from the 0, so you would add a second. But because we are only going to be doing one column, the offset here truly doesn't matter. Okay, so if it wants a 0 or wants some type of value, you can put a value in here, but you're only having one column. You can say OK, and when you zoom out now, you should notice that you have a number of rows. And you can see how many rows that you truly have, and I can get rid of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it looks like 6 rows. All right, so 6 rows away from 20. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 rows. So I'm going to say that this is 14 in my number of rows. Now, you'll be able to play around with this a little bit more. Go ahead and save your title block. And now you can test it again. Because we have assigned it to page 4, you can open up that page 4 on your project. So let's go to the pages and go to page 4. Page 4 has, when we double click to open it, has not been updated yet, but simply right click and go to title block and update, and it will use your latest saved title block, and you should see those numbers show up. And they should show up correctly. Now, if you want to test it further on another page, simply replace it on that secondary page. So you can say replace, find that title block. I like to use the filters tab because it's a little bit faster. Say any class, and there it is. Okay, you can get rid of these outside lines. You can start scaling. Remember that you have a modify and scale, offsets, stretches. You can mirror things. This will give you some nice control. Now at the same time, the big thing to keep in mind is that title blocks are determined in your project template. So in your project template, you would be coming to the configuration drop-down and going to this very first line for project and assigning the title blocks here. These title blocks will be assigned by using this associate button to use the proper title block that you are selecting. It will be browsing to a specific title block, and you would be assigning this in your project template. Now, one last thing to keep in mind though is reports can have their own title blocks individually. So if I go to my bill of materials and I'm looking at the properties here, I can simply go into this area and look at the layout. And in the layout, you will see in this right-hand corner a default title block for this report. And you can come down and associate again by selecting a specific title block for this report. So you can have a lot of different report title blocks depending on how you want things laid out. So these are the types of things to keep in mind. But again, whether you are using just rows or whether you're using rows and columns, those types of pieces are going to be in the title block itself. Now, the last thing to keep in mind is that your libraried title block is what is holding these drawing settings. You always want to make sure that Snap, Grid, and Ortho are turned on and at the settings that you want. The minute that they are assigned into a project, they then have their own identity so that their defaults are only coming in from the library when you are creating a new sheet. So please be very conscious. It is not a global setting. It is per title block. It is per sheet once it's in the project. Well, I hope you found this informative. Please reach out if you are having any complications or anything. We can do a mentoring session with you to teach you a little bit more about title blocks. And please let us know if there is anything further that you would like to see in one of these webinars. We'd love to get your feedback. Thanks and have a great day.